Hi, Lieutenant Colonel Perez here. Welcome to episode 13 of Arguing the OE. Today's topic will be training systems thinking. Now, we've had 5 episodes on design, operational design for joint community and Army design methodology for the Army community. And one of the things that our planning doctrine in both communities specifies is understanding the relationships between stakeholders in those environments where we're going to operate. And I'm going to call that understanding of the stakeholders and relationships between them as systems thinking. And we'll go into more detail in the future about ways of unpacking this, but the very basics are simply identifying who the stakeholders are and what the relationships are. And what I've tried to show with the example of General Rodriguez in a previous episode is by putting things on a whiteboard or a blackboard and putting these relationships up for all to see, we can start as a group engaged in collaboration and dialogue and the competition of ideas. We can start to see and have ideas about different things about what's going on in the environment as well as how we should intervene. So I think that systems thinking and putting it up on a whiteboard as a group, I think is pretty beneficial. The key is how to practice this. And I think this is very, very easy to do. Every day, National Public Radio, as an example, comes on the air, and their website allows you to access their audio clips. So what I'm going to do today is show you how you can use an NPR audio clip in order to expose your staff officers, your NCOs, to thinking in terms of with a systems perspective. So I'm going to play a clip that's going to go about 8 or 9 minutes. As it plays, I'm going to map out the relationships that are described on this board. Now keep in mind that this obviously is one account, a journalist account, of what's going on, in this case, in the Syrian conflict, and this episode is from late May. But other sources of what's going on in the operational environment are similar, to include the reports that our patrollers, once they come back, their debriefs include an account of what's going on in the operational environment. Intelligence reports that we receive from a higher unit also include stories about what's going on in our operational environment. Intelligence reports that our own G2 sections produce are accounts. We want to keep these accounts whole. And I'm going to describe an example of how to map them out so it generates thinking. So bear with me. We'll start the clip. This one is from May 28, 2013. In Damascus, a view of Syria's war turned inside out.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. Good morning. I'm David Green.
And I'm Renee Montaigne. Late yesterday, the European Union announced it was ending an arms embargo on the Syrian opposition that may clear the way for Europeans to send in weapons, though the U.S. remains reluctant to do so. Also yesterday, Republican Senator John McCain slipped into Syria via Turkey. He visited leaders of some of the groups fighting to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad. As pressure mounts on Syria's regime, we'll get a glimpse this week of Syria's war as it looks from the government side of the battle lines. A few days ago, our own Steve Inskeep crossed the border on his way to Syria's capital.
So we're on the road to Damascus, a highway lined with flowers.
And also lined with soldiers. We were stopped at one military checkpoint after another as we drove into the city.
As we've driven into the center of Damascus, which is surrounded by high, dry hills, the only thing that's more common than security checkpoints on the streets is pictures of this country's president, Bashar al-Assad. One of those pictures had a label describing him as the maker of surprises and overcomer of crises.
Right now the crisis is the survival of his regime. If he goes to his office, which overlooks the city from the hillside, Assad can see black smoke rising up from artillery strikes. Rebels hold some of the suburbs. The government controls the center city with the help of the troops at the checkpoints. They range from regular army soldiers in uniform to neighborhood teenagers with T-shirts and Kalashnikovs.
Will ID, please?
The soldier asking for ID is Christian, one of many drawn from religious minorities, Shia Muslims, Druze, and especially Assad's own Alawite sect. Fighters from the Shia group Hezbollah have also come from Lebanon. They oppose a rebellion that includes many of the majority Sunni Muslims here. An uprising that began as a drive to remove Assad has led to fears of sectarian war. At the center of this ancient city is a centuries-old mosque with an unusual Muslim call to prayer. Instead of a single voice, you hear several men sing together. But Damascus is better known for trade than religion. Around the mosque, we walk the stone-paved streets of the ancient bazaar. Business is bad, as we learned in the shop of a fabric seller. Syria's currency has plunged in value. That drives up prices of the imported goods he sells.
تقريبا نعم كل يوم نعم.
Almost every day the price changes, he says. A customer may order cloth at a certain price. Half an hour later, the merchant discovers the latest shift in the exchange rate, meaning it will cost him more to import the cloth than he would earn from the sale.
Your profit margin is less, and your cost of living is higher.
طبعا بالضبط تمام exactly.
Like many people in Damascus, this man declined to give his name and said nothing against the government of Bashar al-Assad. Business groups of all sects have been among Assad's major supporters. Yet the fabric seller is clearly frustrated by the war.
أنا عفوا I'm sorry. أنا ممكن يكون جاي تحت مني من طائفة.
I would like to shout to everybody, he says, don't go the way of sectarian divisions. Fighting has already driven him out of his suburban home, in a no-man's land between the army and rebels. He's one of many people struggling to live normally in a city where life is not normal at all.
Can I just mention, night has fallen, there's a full moon, we're on a rooftop restaurant, and we're listening to the thump of artillery shells in the not too far distance, and we're even watching tracer shells, what appear to be red tracer shells. There go several flying across the sky on the near horizon.
Our dinner companions told us rebels have been fighting the army for months in the eastern suburbs. Once daylight came, the shelling continued. We drove toward the sound of the blasts.
So we're approaching an area of sporadic fighting in the eastern suburbs of Damascus. We are passing mile after mile of rubble, buildings that have been half destroyed, entirely destroyed, houses with holes punched into them.
This used to be a giant strip of suburban auto dealerships of the kind you might see in America. Now the cars are gone, except for the ones left burned out on the road.
10 treads left on the street, piles of fruit left on the road as if a fruit truck spilled its load. The Volvo dealership is shut down.
Black smoke rose from the Honda dealership, which apparently was blasted just before we arrived.
I keep thinking we must have passed the most heavily fought over area, and then we see more smashed up buildings.
Syria's government media say the army is clearing out foreign terrorists in this suburb called Douma. Syrian rebels have been sending out videos of men, women, and children they say are civilians killed by the government shelling. In another Damascus suburb this week, the rebels contend they were attacked with chemical weapons. Our car continued a little beyond the battle zone. We encountered a row of apartment buildings that were still occupied. Some of the buildings were only partially completed before the war, and their concrete shells have now become shelters for refugees from the zone we just passed. We walked up the rough steps of one building with a man we'll call Wallet. He lives here now with his sister, her daughter, and her 14-month-old grandson. When they fled home in Douma, the family salvaged an ornate wooden wall clock, but no furniture. We sat beneath that clock, talking while sitting on the floor.
We are close enough that you can hear regular gunfire, but it's just far enough away that you feel just safe enough to stay here. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. Stray artillery shells have landed in the field across the street, but not on this side.
Do you remember the day that you left Douma for the last time?
Wallet's sister says the family stayed in town through months of shelling, but finally fled on a day when the explosions became unbearable. They loaded the family into somebody else's car and drove until they found this empty building. Many refugees live here with their families. Through an interpreter, we asked if the many children in the complex are accustomed to the gunfire.
والله أنا كبيرة وما تعودت. كبيرة وما تعودت.
I am old enough and I didn't get used yet. I still get scared. So what do you think about the little ones?
This family serves Turkish coffee in ornate china cups, but has no glass in the windows. Wallet, who used to work in construction when there was work, has helped to fix up the place a bit. Improvised electric wiring stretches from room to room.
This looks like a spider web over here, all these wires.
Yeah. But normal.
It's normal here, he says, and maybe that's the strangest thing of all, that this life is normal for Damascus. Other buildings near Wallet are filled with manufacturing employees who see the smoke of burning buildings out their windows, but still work their shifts at steel plants up the road. Two of those plants melt down scrap metal, and we saw workers use a metal claw to sort through a mountain of scrap. That claw was picking up the remnants of many past lives. Car parts, strips of chrome, bits of buildings, rebar, sheet metal, giant steel wheels. Here we can see the only thing that is certain about Syria's future. The war's destruction will in time create more wreckage for the pile.
Okay, so what we've done here for about 9 minutes is listen to an NPR audio clip of a news story about Syria, and this ran about the end of May. And what we're able to do is map out several of the stakeholders and the dynamics that are going on. And if a group of staff officers and NCOs were looking at this, it would prompt other questions. But most importantly, it would give an entire coherent narrative from one perspective about what is going on in Syria. So what are some of the things that very quickly I could tell from mapping this out? Well, here, the group of staff officers, NCOs, would be able to appreciate how it is that strategic decisions made by international governmental organizations and specific countries like the EU and the US deciding to end an embargo, and for the US, as we've now learned, deciding to help partially the Syrian rebels, how this has consequences all the way down to refugees in a broken down building using improvised electricity. We can also ask other questions. For example, this news account gave us a pretty good rundown of the groups that compose the Syrian army, right? But we could also ask another question, which is, what are the groups that compose the rebels? And this has been one of the biggest stumbling blocks for academics and governmental practitioners. If the U.S. and the international community were to step into this conflict, who specifically are the rebels? What groups compose the rebels fighting the Syrian army? What different aims and objectives and resources does each one have? And what is the likelihood, if we were to support a specific rebel group, that it would win out? There's lots of scholarship that says that if we support and take advantage of the concluded embargo, if we support the rebels, this might prolong the conflict. It might not finish it. But these are questions that we can begin to ask if we map this out up on a blackboard or whiteboard for everybody to appreciate and to question. We also see how the economics plays into it, how business is bad, how currency is tied to prices, which is tied to profits, which is tied to the cost of living. We also see that there's business groups that for the most part, regardless of sect, supported the Assad regime. But we also have seen in the same story that there are many businesses that have been destroyed, and they mentioned several auto dealerships. An interesting question for not only for an academic but also for a practitioner would be, why is it that certain groups had their businesses preserved, whereas other groups had them destroyed? And obviously you have the steel mills that are a critical component of the Assad regime. Those are still in operation. What are the mechanisms by which that happens? We can also look at the refugees. And we see that the numbers of refugees as the fighting continues grows. What effect will the embargo's termination have on the number of refugees over time? And how will any country that decides to intervene, how will they handle that problem? And then there's always a problem of reconciliation. At some point, the fighting needs to end. And here you saw a story about child refugees. How is it that their experience having to move from home to home and a damaged building to damaged building in order to avoid getting killed by the fighting, how is that going to affect the prospects when a 14, 15-year-old is now 18, 19, 20 with memories of what he and his family went through? How is this going to affect their prospects for reconciliation and conflict termination? So here, by putting these things up on a whiteboard, we're able to ask a lot of questions. Now, the alternative to this is that we do PMSE-PT analysis, and that's something that I've already discussed in a previous episode. But if we were to do PMSE-PT analysis, we'd break up this story into parts. Everything political, we'll put in this column. Everything economic, we'll put in this column. Everything military, we'll put in this column. Consider the benefits of not doing that, at least in the beginning, and having your staff and command team map everything up on a blackboard or whiteboard, keeping the story whole so that the politics, the economics, and the military factors are all combined and integrated so that we see how they're linked together. Thank you very much. Hope this was helpful.